Nietzsche introduces will to power at this precise point because everything prior has stripped away the illusions that once concealed how values actually arise. Ressentiment, the ascetic ideal, life denial, and nihilism were not detours. They were necessary stages in clearing the ground. Only now can Nietzsche ask the question he has been circling all along: what gives values their force? Earlier in the analysis, this question could not yet be posed honestly. As long as moral, religious, or rational authorities were still taken seriously, values appeared to descend from somewhere beyond life itself. God, truth, reason, or morality seemed to command value. Will to power would have sounded like reductionism or provocation if introduced too soon. Nihilism changes this entirely. Once inherited values collapse, it becomes impossible to pretend that meaning is discovered rather than produced. The authority that once guaranteed values has vanished. What remains is life itself, acting, interpreting, organizing, and asserting significance without external sanction. Nietzsche introduces will to power here because critique has reached its limit. Exposing false values is no longer enough. If values are not given, then their origin must be explained. Will to power is Nietzsche's attempt to name that origin without reinstalling metaphysics. This concept does not replace God, morality, or truth as a new authority. It does the opposite. It explains why such authorities ever had force in the first place. Will to power names the underlying activity through which life interprets the world, establishes priorities, and imposes meaning. Nietzsche is careful not to present this as a doctrine. Will to power is not something one chooses to believe in. It is a descriptive principle, an attempt to articulate what life does once the illusions of given meaning have fallen away. The timing matters. If will to power were introduced before nihilism, it would appear as a rival belief system. Introduced after nihilism, it appears as an explanation of why belief systems ever worked. It shifts the analysis from what should we believe to how belief gains force at all. This is why Nietzsche does not present will to power as comforting. It offers no reassurance. It does not promise stability or harmony. It explains why conflict, difference, and struggle are inseparable from value creation. Where values exist, power has already been exercised. By placing will to power here, Nietzsche completes the movement from critique to genesis. He is no longer dismantling old meanings. He is preparing to show how meaning is produced, sustained, and contested by life itself. At this point, the center of Nietzsche's philosophy shifts decisively. The problem is no longer nihilism, nor even affirmation versus denial. The problem is now how life creates values once no authority stands above it. That problem governs everything that follows. Nietzsche knows that the phrase will to power invites immediate misunderstanding. Before he can explain what the concept does, he blocks what it is not. If this clarification is missed, everything that follows collapses into caricature. Power, for Nietzsche, is not brute force. It is not violence, domination, political control, or the desire to rule others. Those are possible expressions of power under certain conditions, but they are not its essence. To reduce will to power to aggression is to mistake a symptom for the source. Nietzsche uses power to name capacity, the capacity to act, to shape, to interpret, to impose form. Power is not something one possesses like an object. It is something that expresses itself. Where life is active, power is already at work. This is why Nietzsche rejects the idea that power is primarily about survival. Survival is minimal. Power seeks expansion, intensification, and expression. A life that merely survives is already exhausted. Will to power explains why life pushes beyond equilibrium instead of resting in it. Power, in this sense, is inseparable from difference. Wherever there are differences in strength, perspective, or capacity, power relations exist. These relations are not moral judgments. They are descriptive facts of life. Equality of power is an abstraction, not a reality. Nietzsche also blocks the idea that will to power is conscious intention. Life does not calculate power in advance. Power expresses itself prior to reflection. Instincts, habits, interpretations, and values emerge before rational justification appears. This is why Nietzsche insists that even morality expresses power. Moral systems do not negate will to power. They are particular configurations of it. Restraint, denial, humility, and obedience are not absences of power, but redirected power. Power can therefore appear in subtle forms. The power to endure, to resist, to organize, to interpret, to define meaning. These are often stronger than physical domination. A culture that shapes values exerts more power than one that merely coerces. Nietzsche's use of the term power is deliberately broad because life itself is broad. Wherever something imposes an interpretation that holds, power is already operating. Where an interpretation fails, power has weakened. This is why Nietzsche treats will to power as unavoidable. One cannot step outside it. Even rejecting power is an expression of power in a particular form. The question is never whether power exists, but how it is expressed. By blocking the crude misreadings here, Nietzsche clears the way for his real claim, that will to power is not a moral ideal, a political program, or a psychological urge, but the underlying dynamic through which life produces meaning, value, and form. Nietzsche's most radical move is to detach will to power from the language of desire. Will to power is not a craving for power, nor a conscious aim that life pursues. It is the deeper activity through which life interprets the world before it ever wants anything in particular. For Nietzsche, interpretation comes first. Life does not encounter a neutral reality and then decide what to do with it. It organizes what it encounters, selects what matters, assigns weight, and orders experience according to its strength. This ordering is already an expression of power. This is why Nietzsche rejects the idea that truth is discovered. Truth is an interpretation that has won, an interpretation that has proven strong enough to endure, to organize behavior, and to suppress alternatives. What we call objectivity is often just a dominant perspective that has forgotten its origin. Will to power explains why perspectives compete. Different forms of life impose different interpretations. Each interpretation tries to stabilize the world in its own image, to make reality legible and manageable according to its capacities. Where interpretations clash, power relations are already at work. This competition is not necessarily violent. Most of the time, it is subtle. Language, concepts, moral categories, and standards of reason all function as interpretive tools. They shape what can be seen, thought, and valued. To control interpretation is to exercise power at its deepest level. Nietzsche insists that interpretation is unavoidable. Even claiming to describe reality as it is itself an interpretation, one that privileges certain criteria over others. The will to power operates not by adding meaning to a neutral world, but by constituting meaning in the first place. This is why will to power cannot be reduced to psychology. It is not a motive among others. It is the condition under which motives arise. Desires are already shaped by prior interpretations of what counts as desirable, possible, or forbidden. Nietzsche's insight here undermines the hope for a final, neutral account of reality. There is no standpoint outside interpretation from which truth can be guaranteed once and for all. What exists instead is a dynamic field of perspectives, each expressing a different configuration of power. This does not mean all interpretations are equal. Some endure, organize, and generate coherence. Others collapse. Power differentiates interpretations by their capacity to hold, to structure life, coordinate action, and resist dissolution. Understanding will to power as interpretation clarifies why Nietzsche moves beyond critique. If values are interpretations backed by power, then the task is no longer to ask which values are true, but which interpretations express strength rather than exhaustion. This shift changes everything. Meaning is no longer something to be uncovered. It is something that emerges from life's interpretive force. Where that force weakens, meanings decay. Where it intensifies, new values take shape. Will to power, understood this way, is not a desire for domination. It is the fundamental activity through which life makes a world it can inhabit. Nietzsche's claim here is deliberately unsettling. There are no values that stand outside will to power. Moral values, religious ideals, truths, and standards of reason are not exceptions to this dynamic. They are among its most refined expressions. This does not mean that values are cynical inventions or conscious manipulations. It means that values emerge from forms of life that have sufficient strength to impose their interpretations and make them endure. A value persists not because it is true in itself, but because it continues to organize life effectively. Nietzsche insists that even values which appear to oppose power, humility, obedience, self-denial, are not negations of will to power. They are reconfigurations of it. When direct expression is blocked, power turns inward. It reshapes instincts, redirects aggression, and establishes new standards that favor restraint over expansion. This is why Nietzsche rejects the idea that morality transcends life. Moral systems do not descend from reason or divine command. They crystallize from struggles between interpretations. One interpretation gains dominance, stabilizes itself, and presents its values as universal or necessary. Truth functions the same way. What a culture calls truth is often an interpretation that has become invisible through success. It no longer appears as an interpretation at all, but as reality itself. Competing perspectives are marginalized, dismissed, or rendered unintelligible. Nietzsche's point is not relativism. He does not claim that any value can be sustained arbitrarily. Values endure only while they have the power to organize behavior, motivate commitment, and resist erosion. When that power weakens, values decay, regardless of how sacred they once seemed. This explains why values collapse historically. They do not fail because they are refuted intellectually. They fail because the forms of life that produced them weaken. New interpretations gain force, old ones lose it, and the value landscape shifts. Will to power therefore explains both continuity and change. It accounts for why some values dominate for centuries and why others vanish quickly. It also explains why critique alone cannot destroy values. A value collapses only when the life that sustains it can no longer bear its weight. Understanding values as expressions of will to power removes their aura of inevitability. It shows that values are contingent on strength, capacity, and vitality. They are achievements, not givens. This insight is unsettling because it removes moral comfort. There is no guarantee that the best values will prevail. There is only struggle between interpretations, each seeking to organize life in its own way. Nietzsche does not present this as a recommendation. He presents it as a description of reality once metaphysical guarantees are gone. Values exist because life expresses power through interpretation. When that expression falters, values falter with it. This is why Nietzsche insists that understanding will to power is essential. Without it, values appear mysterious or sacred. With it, values become intelligible as living forces, rising and falling with the strength of the life that creates them. Nietzsche draws a sharp distinction between will to power and the instinct for mere survival. Survival, he argues, is a minimum condition. It explains why life persists, but not why it expands, creates, or transforms. A life oriented only towards survival is already in decline. Many philosophies treat self-preservation as the primary drive. Nietzsche rejects this. If survival were life's deepest aim, life would seek equilibrium, safety, and rest. But life consistently does the opposite. It risks itself, overreaches, experiments, and exposes itself to danger. These are not anomalies, they are expressions of power. Will to power explains this excess. Life does not merely want to continue, it wants to intensify. It seeks to extend its influence, deepen its form, and impose its perspective. Growth, not safety, is the signature of vitality. This is why Nietzsche is suspicious of moral systems that elevate preservation above all else. When safety becomes the highest value, life narrows around avoidance. Risk is treated as pathology. Ambition is moralized as greed. Strength is reframed as threat. From Nietzsche's perspective, such systems do not protect life, they protect weakness. They organize existence around minimization rather than expansion. Survival replaces creation as the measure of success. Will to power, by contrast, explains why life repeatedly exceeds what is necessary. Art, philosophy, exploration, and self-overcoming cannot be reduced to survival needs. They are costly, risky, and often destabilizing, yet life produces them again and again. Nietzsche insists that this excess is not irrational. It is life expressing its force. Where vitality is strong, life seeks challenge rather than comfort. Where vitality is weak, life seeks protection rather than possibility. This distinction clarifies why nihilism follows prolonged life denial. When survival is overvalued and expansion suppressed, life loses the capacity to create meaning. What remains is endurance without direction. Will to power reframes the question of value. Instead of asking whether something helps us survive, Nietzsche asks whether it enhances life's force. Does it increase capacity, deepen experience, and open new possibilities? Or does it merely keep life going at a reduced level? Nietzsche does not deny the necessity of survival. Without survival, nothing follows. But when survival becomes the highest aim, life stagnates. Preservation without expansion becomes decay. Understanding will to power as distinct from survival reveals why Nietzsche's philosophy is so hostile to moralities of safety. Life, for Nietzsche, is not meant to be conserved like an object. It is meant to be expressed. This distinction sets up the next development. If life seeks expansion rather than equilibrium, then conflict, difference, and hierarchy are not accidents. They are unavoidable features of how life operates. Nietzsche insists that conflict is not a failure of life. It is one of its fundamental expressions. Once will to power is understood as the tendency of life to expand, interpret, and impose form, conflict becomes unavoidable. Where there are multiple interpretations, perspectives collide. Where forces differ in strength, hierarchy emerges. Nietzsche's claim here is descriptive, not moral. He is not praising domination or condemning equality. He is explaining why difference in strength cannot be eliminated without denying life itself. Life does not unfold evenly. Capacities vary, energies differ, perspectives compete. Hierarchy, in this sense, is not a social program. It is the observable outcome of unequal forces interacting. Some interpretations organize life more effectively than others. Some values endure because they have greater force behind them. Others fade because they cannot sustain themselves. This is why Nietzsche is hostile to moral systems that attempt to flatten difference. When equality is imposed as a value regardless of capacity, vitality is restrained rather than cultivated. Life is forced into uniformity in the name of fairness. Nietzsche does not deny the appeal of such systems. Equality promises safety and predictability. It reduces conflict by lowering expectations. But in doing so, it suppresses excellence, experimentation, and risk, the very conditions under which new values arise. Conflict for Nietzsche is productive when it expresses strength rather than resentment. Struggle between interpretations drives development. Ideas sharpen through resistance. Cultures evolve through tension. Where conflict disappears entirely, stagnation follows. This is why Nietzsche treats hierarchy as unavoidable. Attempts to eliminate hierarchy do not remove power relations. They drive them underground. Power reappears in subtler forms: moral pressure, guilt, conformity, and surveillance. Nietzsche's analysis is unsettling because it refuses moral comfort. There is no final arrangement in which all conflict disappears and life remains vibrant. Life's creativity depends on difference, and difference generates tension. This does not mean Nietzsche advocates cruelty or oppression. He is describing the conditions under which life produces value, not prescribing how societies should be organized. To confuse these is to reintroduce morality where he is offering analysis. Understanding conflict and hierarchy as expressions of will to power clarifies why Nietzsche rejects utopian moral visions. A world without tension would be a world without creation. Life, for Nietzsche, is not a problem to be solved. It is a force to be understood, and it expresses itself through struggle, difference, and uneven strength. Nietzsche grounds will to power not in abstract theory, but in the body. This is a decisive move. He rejects the idea that values originate in pure reason, detached consciousness, or moral insight. Values arise from physiological states, from strength, weakness, health, exhaustion, and tension in the living body. For Nietzsche, the body is not a passive vessel carrying ideas. It is an active interpreter. Long before conscious thought appears, the body evaluates. It reacts, resists, adapts, and asserts itself. What later becomes a belief or a value begins as a bodily orientation toward the world. This is why Nietzsche treats exhaustion as philosophically significant. A tired body does not merely feel different, it interprets differently. What once felt possible now feels dangerous. What once felt exciting now feels irresponsible. Under exhaustion, restraint appears wise, and affirmation appears reckless. Conversely, vitality alters perception. A strong body does not experience challenge as threat, but as opportunity. Difficulty feels stimulating rather than overwhelming. Risk becomes attractive rather than frightening. Values shift accordingly. Nietzsche's insistence on the body explains why moral systems change across history. It is not because humanity becomes wiser, but because conditions of life change. Scarcity produces different values than abundance. Stability produces different values than crisis. Values track physiology more closely than ideas. This also explains why arguments rarely change values. One cannot reason a body out of exhaustion. One cannot argue vitality into existence. Where strength is lacking, denial feels necessary regardless of how compelling affirmation might sound. Will to power therefore operates beneath conscious intention. It expresses itself through posture, mood, preference, and instinct. Conscious beliefs often arrive later, as justifications for what the body has already decided. Nietzsche's emphasis on the body is not reductive. He is not saying that humans are nothing but physiology. He is saying that thinking is inseparable from living. Values emerge from the conditions under which thinking occurs. This insight dismantles the fantasy of neutral philosophy. There is no view from nowhere. Every interpretation expresses a particular bodily condition. Some interpretations expand life, others protect it. Some arise from surplus, others from depletion. Understanding will to power as bodily explains why life denial becomes dominant under exhaustion. When energy is low, restraint feels virtuous. When vitality returns, affirmation becomes possible again. This is why Nietzsche's critique is not moral. He does not condemn values born of weakness. He diagnoses them. And he insists that overcoming them requires not argument, but a change in the conditions of life themselves. Will to power, rooted in the body, explains why value creation is rare and why it cannot be commanded. It emerges only where life has enough strength to risk itself again. Nietzsche draws one of his most important distinctions here. The difference between creative will to power and reactive will to power. Both are expressions of power, but they move in opposite directions. Reactive will to power emerges when direct expression is blocked. Energy that cannot move outward turns inward. Instead of creating new values, it responds to existing ones. It defines itself through opposition, resentment, and negation. Its activity depends on what it reacts against. This is why ressentiment is not the absence of power, but a distorted expression of it. The reactive individual still wills, still interprets, still values, but always in reference to an external enemy or standard. Meaning is borrowed through negation rather than generated independently. Reactive power is psychologically economical. It does not need to risk creation. It does not need to expose itself. It gains orientation by condemning, criticizing, or inverting what already exists. This makes it stable, but also sterile. Creation, by contrast, does not begin from opposition. Creative will to power does not need an enemy. It generates values from surplus rather than injury. It does not ask what must be destroyed, but what can be brought into being. Nietzsche insists that creation is rare because it requires exposure. To create is to risk failure without moral insulation. There is no guarantee that a new value will endure. There is no authority to appeal to if it collapses. Creation stands naked. This is why reactive power often masquerades as strength. Destruction feels decisive. Condemnation feels righteous. Critique feels intelligent. Creation feels uncertain, vulnerable, and slow. Nietzsche also notes that reactive power tends to moralize. It justifies itself by appeal to higher principles. Creative power does the opposite. It does not seek moral permission. It asserts and waits to see if it holds. This difference explains why life-denying values have been so historically successful. They were reactive but stable. They organized exhaustion efficiently. Creative values, by contrast, emerge only under conditions of surplus and must struggle to survive. Nietzsche's critique here is not moral condemnation. He does not accuse reactive types of bad faith. Reaction is often necessary under constraint. But reaction cannot be the source of new values. It depends too heavily on what it negates. Creation requires a different posture. It affirms itself without comparison. It risks meaning without guarantee. It is not defined by opposition, but by expression. Understanding this distinction clarifies why Nietzsche's philosophy cannot stop at critique. Critique is reactive. It clears space, but it does not fill it. Only creation can do that. Will to power, in its highest form, is not domination or destruction. It is the capacity to create values that can stand on their own. Nietzsche is explicit that will to power is not a moral ideal, and this clarification is essential to avoid turning his analysis into yet another doctrine. Will to power does not tell us what we ought to value, how we should live, or which form of life is morally superior. It explains how valuing happens at all. If will to power were treated as an ideal, something to be pursued or maximized, it would immediately collapse back into the moral structure Nietzsche has been dismantling. It would become another command placed above life, another standard by which existence must justify itself. Nietzsche refuses this move deliberately. Will to power is descriptive, not prescriptive. It names the dynamic through which life interprets, orders, and asserts meaning once external authorities have lost credibility. It does not instruct life. It describes what life is already doing. This is why Nietzsche resists moralizing power. Power is not good or bad in itself. It takes different forms depending on the condition of life expressing it. The same underlying dynamic can produce creative flourishing or rigid domination, expansion or suffocation. To treat will to power as an ethical goal would be to misunderstand its role. Ethics already presupposes values. Will to power explains how those values emerge in the first place. It operates prior to morality, not within it. Nietzsche's refusal to moralize also prevents a dangerous simplification. If will to power were equated with strength as virtue, then weakness would automatically become vice. Nietzsche explicitly rejects this. Weakness is not immoral. It is a condition that produces certain interpretations of life. By keeping will to power outside morality, Nietzsche preserves the ability to analyze values without judging them by the standards those values themselves produce. This is what allows him to critique morality without replacing it with another moral code. This also explains why Nietzsche never calls on people to embrace will to power. One cannot opt into it. One already lives within it. Even resistance to power is an expression of power in a particular configuration. Understanding will to power as non-moral prevents its co-option into ideology. When it is turned into a slogan or justification, it loses explanatory force and becomes another tool of domination, exactly the outcome Nietzsche warns against. Will to power, properly understood, does not tell us what to value. It tells us why values have force when they do. It shifts attention away from moral justification and toward the conditions under which interpretations gain strength. This refusal to moralize marks a crucial restraint in Nietzsche's thought. He explains relentlessly, but he does not command. Creation cannot be legislated. Nietzsche is acutely aware that will to power is vulnerable to misuse, and he anticipates this danger explicitly. When the concept is simplified, moralized, or politicized, it ceases to explain life and begins to justify brutality. The most common misuse is to equate will to power with the right to dominate. In this distortion, power becomes permission, strength becomes entitlement. Violence appears justified simply because it is effective. Nietzsche rejects this outright. This is not an expression of will to power, but a crude reduction of it. Such misuse arises when description is mistaken for endorsement. Nietzsche explains how power operates. He does not bless its outcomes. To read will to power as a moral green light is to reinstall morality under a different name, the morality of force. Another misuse occurs when will to power is turned into an ideology. When abstracted into slogans, it loses nuance and becomes rigid. Ideology freezes interpretation. It demands conformity to a simplified image of strength. This rigidity is itself a sign of weakness. Nietzsche insists that genuine power is flexible. It adapts, interprets, reshapes. Ideological uses of will to power do the opposite. They reduce life to a single posture and demand repetition. What begins as an explanation of vitality becomes a straitjacket. There is also the danger of psychological projection. Individuals may use will to power to rationalize their own aggression, resentment, or insecurity. By naming their impulses natural, they avoid self-understanding. This is not strength, it is avoidance. Nietzsche's restraint here is deliberate. He refuses to offer will to power as a banner. He knows that once a concept becomes a rallying point, it stops explaining and starts commanding. Command belongs to morality, explanation does not. This is why Nietzsche avoids system building. Systems invite enforcement. Will to power cannot be enforced without contradiction. The moment it becomes a rule, it negates itself. Understanding this danger is essential. The power of the concept lies in its capacity to illuminate how values arise and decay. When it is used to justify action directly, it becomes indistinguishable from the moralities Nietzsche spent his life dismantling. Nietzsche's warning is implicit but firm. Do not turn explanation into permission. Will to power explains why certain forms of life prevail. It does not tell us which should. Misuse of the concept reveals the very thing Nietzsche is analyzing, the impulse to replace lost authorities with new ones. Will to power is not meant to fill that void. It is meant to expose how such voids are filled at all. Nietzsche insists that will to power explains, it does not instruct. This distinction is crucial because the temptation to turn explanation into a program is exactly what his philosophy is trying to resist. A program tells people what to do, it offers rules, goals, or methods to follow. Will to power does none of this. It does not propose a way of life, a political system, or a personal ethic. It describes the underlying dynamic through which life already operates once external authorities have lost their hold. This is why Nietzsche refuses to present will to power as something to be applied. One cannot apply it without misunderstanding it. Will to power is not a tool in the hands of the individual. It is the force that shapes individuals, values, and interpretations long before conscious intention intervenes. Life expresses power unconsciously. Instincts select, organize, and prioritize before reasons are given. Rational justifications usually arrive afterward, serving to stabilize and defend what has already taken shape. Will to power names this prior movement. Nietzsche's explanatory use of the concept allows him to unify what otherwise appears fragmented. Morality, truth, art, religion, science, and culture all become intelligible as different configurations of interpretive force. What changes across history is not the presence of power, but the form it takes. This is why Nietzsche resists the illusion of control. If will to power is foundational, then no individual stands outside it, directing it at will. Attempts to master or command power are themselves expressions of power in a particular form, often a reactive one. Understanding will to power as explanation prevents moral panic and ideological enthusiasm alike. It does not demand that one become stronger, harsher, or more assertive. It clarifies why certain values dominate and why others decay. This explanatory restraint also explains Nietzsche's style. He does not conclude with commandments because commandments would contradict his analysis. To issue prescriptions would be to pretend that values can be installed by decree rather than grown from life. Will to power, then, is not a destination. It is a lens. It allows us to see value creation, value decay, conflict, and hierarchy without appealing to metaphysical guarantees or moral absolutes. By refusing to turn will to power into a program, Nietzsche preserves its analytic force. It remains unsettling precisely because it offers no shelter, only understanding. This understanding prepares the final movement of the analysis. If will to power explains how values arise, then the remaining question is no longer theoretical. It is typological. What kind of being is capable of creating values that endure? At this point, Nietzsche's analysis reaches a natural limit. Will to power explains how values arise, how interpretations gain force, and why some meanings endure while others collapse. But explanation alone is no longer sufficient. A new question now presses forward. What kind of being is capable of creating values that do not immediately decay? This is where the figure of the overman enters, not as a fantasy ideal, but as a type. Nietzsche is not describing a goal for humanity as a whole, nor offering a blueprint for self-improvement. He is identifying the kind of life in which creative will to power is no longer reactive, defensive, or borrowed. Will to power, left at the explanatory level, remains abstract. It tells us that values are created through force, interpretation, and vitality. The overman names the embodied possibility of this process, a form of life that can create values without leaning on resentment, denial, or inherited authority. Nietzsche introduces this type because not all forms of life can create values. Most lives interpret defensively. They preserve, repeat, and adapt existing meanings. Value creation requires surplus, strength sufficient to risk new interpretations without needing them to be justified by tradition or morality. The overman is therefore not defined by domination, intelligence, or superiority over others. He is defined by independence from reactive valuation. His values do not arise from opposition, grievance, or negation. They arise from affirmation and creative force. This explains why Nietzsche does not present the overman earlier. As long as nihilism was unresolved, any talk of creation would sound arbitrary. Will to power must first explain the mechanics of value before the possibility of a new type can be meaningfully raised. The overman also clarifies why Nietzsche never offers universal solutions. If value creation depends on type, then it cannot be democratized or legislated. New values emerge through particular forms of life, not collective agreement. This does not mean Nietzsche dismisses humanity. It means he rejects the idea that values can be designed for everyone at once. The overman represents a threshold, not a destiny, a point at which life is strong enough to create without denial. By ending will to power here, Nietzsche shifts the analysis again. The problem is no longer nihilism nor even value creation in the abstract. It is the question of what kind of life can affirm existence so fully that it becomes creative rather than reactive. That question does not yet have a final answer, but it now has a direction.